Thank you so much. And apologies for the late arrival. I know we were having some technical issues on the various Zoom chat rooms, so it looks like we're all now here in the same place. And actually, I feel fortunate that I had a chance to follow Alexi's presentation because a number of the things he said are points that I would have raised and are points that I agree with in terms of how we perceive or frame great power competition. So first, just as to get started again, um, I thank you all for hosting this event for NIICE, for putting this rather complex two-day event together. The panels all work in, and I think, a really interesting mosaic of topics and perspectives. I will say from my vantage, not just coming from the US, but the Near East South Asia Center, which is a US government entity. I'll have to use the disclaimer. The views I express are my own and not that of the NESA Center or the US government, but that's fine. And I'm also happy to answer any questions on points I've raised or points perhaps I don't raise, given the time limit. And I should say, given the time limit, and especially given what we've just heard, I want to raise three quick points and then really turn it to the other speakers and then beyond for our discussion. And the first is when we look at this issue of great power competition, and I do think it's an important term to bring up, but we also have to reimagine it. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely one who believes we have long since passed. In fact, I'm not even sure if we ever really had a so-called unipolar moment. We're in a multipolar phase, or what I sometimes suggest is a non-polar phase. Because given the subregions, given the areas of the world, certain countries are engaged, others are not. Some countries focus primarily in the Western Hemisphere, others in Europe and Africa, Latin America. So the Asia Pacific states, um, we really have to look at who's engaged within this region and why. I will say, and this is a reality, in the US, we're definitely looking at a change. And, obviously, with what's happened last month with the election of Donald Trump for a second non-consecutive term, the second time in US history this has happened, um, we're going to see some of our perceptions of great power competition challenged. You just have to go back to his first administration and look at how he framed issues. And yes, there is a notion of targeting specific states. Our colleague from Russia knows full well that we look at Russia in a particular through a particular lens, and obviously the conflict in Ukraine. We look at China as the so-called near-peer competitor. I don't think that perspective will change. And then you look at what I consider to be episodic challenges or challenges of a specific nature, Iran, North Korea, and we can look at others. Um, what I would say in this context is we're seeing the US broadly, not just the president, not just, Donald Trump and his perspective, but I would argue a greater share of the American population is increasingly looking away from the so-called, global policeman or the approach of the U.S. as an actor that engages throughout the world, that starts forever wars, and is rethinking where it's positioned. As I look at the past years and I can see, the administrations of George Herbert Walker Bush, of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush as kind of the prime example of the post-Cold War globalist approach to security. So all the issues of rules-based order, Western-framed security organizations or economic organizations, in many ways were at their height, even using the United Nations to promote certain views. I even look at the so-called freedom agenda of George W. Bush, right? This was the view that somehow democratization, Western approaches would develop in other parts of the world. This is part of our engagement. Interestingly, we can almost go back to the 2008 economic crisis a retrenchment in a number of European countries in the US about where we prioritize our resources. But you almost see the succession of administrations. I look at it in my country from Obama to Trump, yes to Biden, now back to Trump, as ones that are more inward looking. And you look at their narratives, yes, they did raise issues of foreign policy and security policy, but so much more of their discourse is on internal issues, on domestic issues. And we take a step further, I would say, in Trump 2.0, and we're going to see very much this, so-called America First approach of national policy. What does this mean? Pure and simple, it means focusing on the homeland, on the economy, on our borders. You look at the Heritage Foundation Project 2025, it's publicly accessible. I would read this. It is a roadmap for a number of key officials within the Trump administration. Will all of it be carried out? No. But a significant portion, at least, is aspired by the administration. And so much of it focuses on economics, demographics, and security as narrowly defined as security in the borders. And so what does this mean for foreign adventures? It means we'll be selectively engaged. Just look at Trump's comments on Syria. That's not our problem. These are the sorts of challenges we'll have. So as kind of a final thought, I would say, when I look at, a great power competition is in a non-polar world. We're going to be looking at national interest. I'll say looking ahead, if I'm examining where the US will play in the Asia Pacific space and also what could be priorities, it's going to be on economics, economics, economics. And in particular, the rivalry or competition, if we'll use that word, with China. Again, I appreciate the previous comments because I do believe we have two countries that are linked together. Yes, there are efforts to de-risk. That's the phrase or term of art. There's a saber rattling on things like tariffs and trade trade limits, etc. We'll see how these go. I look at this sometimes as the opening salvos in a negotiation. And you're going to present extreme positions and somehow work to the middle. Because in all of this, I do see the chance for not just competition, but cooperation. And don't be fooled that, these are not ideological divides. These are rather divides on views of one's role in the region and one's role, if you will, as a national power. If the US is less concerned about being a global policeman, perhaps it will focus more on some of these, if you will, domestic challenges that have international implications, trade being the most important. And so it really is going to be based on how we frame this. And I will make, as I close, an important comment that is any prediction about what's going to happen in the next few years for the US, particularly as it relates to the Asia Pacific space and also its view as a so-called great power in a competitive space, take with some caution. We have yet to see who the players are going to be. I was speaking with a number of Chinese academics the other week, and as we look at the appointments of certain individuals, Mark Rubio as Secretary of State, Waltz as the National Security Advisor, these are China hawks. These are people who are hard on China. Trump is that as well, but he also was looking for an opportunity to make a so-called deal that could be beneficial for the US. And that's something you'll want to think about. So when I look at competitive spaces, increasingly, I'm going to tell the audience, and I'll be curious what the next speakers have to say, how other countries step up in the region, India among them. But how do we look at multinational organizations, ASEAN, SCO, you name it? I think these are increasingly going to be important in the region. And so just to close, I'll leave with looking ahead with three quick thoughts. If we only look at the region through great power competition, we do this at our peril. We need to expand really and reframe how we look at countries interacting in the region. And while it sounds idealistic, I may say that there are going to be local and regional elements of cooperation. We need to take our 20th century terms and move them into the 21st century. Secondly, US, China, clearly competitive, but don't rule out the possibility of even some, at least hoped for aspired summit. President Trump invited Xi Jinping to his inauguration. Of course, it's not going to be carried out, but don't expect that to be the last effort to engage or interact. And then thirdly, we are going to have to look for wild cards in the region. I made reference to Syria. For Middle East watchers, of course, that was a surprise. What we saw in Bangladesh months ago, again, a surprise, at least to a number of outside observers. Could we see other crises or other wildcard events that may shape how large powers interact with each other in the Asia-Pacific space? Absolutely. I'll leave it at that. I look forward to hearing what our other speakers have to say and for the questions and comments from the audience. So again, thank you so much for your time and attention.